Hi, my name is Nadia Nieves. I'm currently a political science and history major, and today I'll be sharing my nonviolent protest presentation with you guys. Exercising the right to protest under the First Amendment is one of the most beneficial ways to make positive change. Nonviolent protests vary from marches, speeches, boycotts, and art. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. Taking action is heroic." This is the thing about protest. There could always be potential danger, but standing for what's right is always better than being on the sidelines. Nonviolent acts are favorable when getting a point across. When violence is added to the event, it's often shut down and not taken seriously. Let's take the storm on the Capitol, for example. What was the protesters' point? As we're taught in grade school, violence is never the answer, and this message should be acknowledged whenever thinking of an event to portray a positive message. Would you rather listen to someone trashing your house or speaking to you directly? Since the early 1800s, people of color have been fighting for equality, not to be seen as better, but to be seen as accepted in the middle ground. Yet instead of fighting back the ways they were treated with barbarity, they found peaceful ways to protest. Many African Americans focused on economic boycotts. They were well aware of the power they held for generating wealth for the state. They came together and decided to fight against the system in the most calm way, without ruthlessness. Now, how do we become such a segregated society? Let's take a look at the Civil War. The Civil War was fought over the role of slaves. Long story short, the North won and all slaves were supposed to be freed. But to what extent? Jim Crow laws were also created nearly immediately after the Battle of the Civil War to disenfranchise African Americans. Yet separating blacks and whites wasn't the only purpose. They also wanted it to be a way to stop blacks for any opportunities that would help them in general. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local laws that legitimized racial segregation, named after a character on a black show. They lasted about 100 years until 1968. They denied African Americans the right to vote, get a job, get an education, and any other opportunities that would help them prosper. Those who were to defy Jim Crow laws were often fined, jailed, and killed. Taking a stand against any authority comes with danger. The most important takeaway is how you respond to the treatment. As a result, the Civil War profoundly changed the nation from influences on the workforce, reconstructing the economy, and making changes in general. Yet even after the battle was done, whites couldn't handle the idea of a black individual having the same amount of success. One of the first nonviolent protests recorded was in 1841. Frederick Douglass and his friends James F. Buffum protested the Eastern Railroad's refusal to allow them to travel first class with the whites. The conductor and two brakemen attempted to remove them from their seats. A fight broke out, but this was only because they had such force. As you can see, violence of violence, there's no solution. Let's start with some key figures. Gandhi. Gandhi was a major leader of the Indian independence movement and a designer of nonviolent civil disobedience that would affect the world. His teachings influenced King and Rosa Parks. Gandhi is most known for his philosophy of nonviolence. The essence of nonviolence technique is that it seeks to liquidate antagonisms but not the antagonist. Gandhi took the religious principle, doing no harm, common to Buddhism, and turned it into a nonviolent tool for mass action. He used it to fight not only colonial rule, but social evils such as racial discrimination and untouchability as well. Let's talk about Parks. Right here, seat number 12. Parks was sitting at seat number 12 behind the sacred 10 seats permanently reserved for white riders. According to the Montgomery City Code, a driver could order a black passenger to relinquish a seat only if vacant seats were available in the rear section, yet there were no vacant seats. Therefore, the bus driver asking Rosa to remove herself was against Chapter 6, Section 10 to 11 in the Montgomery City Code. Yet under the Jim Crow laws of Alabama state, it only states the conductor or agent of the motor transportation company in charge of any vehicle is authorized and required to assign each passenger to the division of the vehicle designated for the race to which the passenger belongs. The situation often leads people to believe whether or not Rosa Parks went against the law. 3 days later, after Parks' arrest, not a single person of color boarded a bus. They found ways to make it to their jobs, families, and pick up their kids. The workers of the Black community were well aware of the inequality they faced. Therefore, they looked at nonviolent ways of protesting, which would lead to an era of positive change through peace. The Black community were the ones most well known to use public transportation. Therefore, they were a large part of generating wealth for the economy of Montgomery and surrounding areas. How about Martin Luther King? King opposed racism, imperialism, poverty, and political disenfranchisement, in increasingly radical terms. He believed the civil rights movement would demand economic rights to work, income, housing, and security. He envisioned a world where all colors would be able to sit at a table. King's vision of economic freedom was rooted in his intellectual development and early experiences in the Southern Black freedom movement. King dreamed of a world free of racism. He often led marches and is most well known for his speech, "I Have a Dream." But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. King wasn't a man of negativity. He grew from the dirt thrown at him. He rose beyond all the doubts others had of him, and he took the hate he received and made it his reason to keep going. King's "I Have a Dream" speech outlined the racial injustice in America and pushed his audience to hold the country accountable to its own founding promises of freedom, justice, and equality. He peacefully argues that the promises of the Declaration of Independence should apply to all. Economics. Blacks, on average, had much lower incomes than whites and were comparable professional or educational groups. For example, in 1959, the median income of Black men was 58% of the median of all men. The equivalent value for Black women was 57%. Second, the relative income of Blacks declined as their skill levels increased. For example, for college students, the average Black income was 60% of the total income of all men, while the proportion of elementary school students was 75%. Blacks focused on low-level work, with few working as managers, freelancers, salespeople, or craftsmen. The educational levels, if not quality, of the two groups were similar, but the distribution of Black jobs was not as good as those of whites. The unemployment rate for Blacks was about twice that for whites. After all, the relative position of Blacks has hardly risen over time, except during World War II. African Americans played a major role in the majority of community jobs, such as the industrial and agricultural field. To get to these places, most could only afford public transportation, from railroads to buses and boat rides. The buses were local and easily accessible, but the laws regarding the transportation were the issue. In choosing to boycott buses, the economy decreased. The message African Americans were trying to portray had worked. It didn't happen overnight, and the city and states realized, hey, we need to find ways to get these people back to riding our transportation. And as a result, they got what they fought for. Segregation laws on buses would be deemed unconstitutional. Let's talk about nonviolence in 2021 in media coverage. Today's movements, such as Black Lives Matter, who focus on nonviolent protests, begin peacefully, but a conflict of interest could spark on both sides. For example, George Floyd's death. It's one that could be a trigger moment for many. Colored individuals face a lot of discrimination, and seeing one of their members lost again is hurtful. When will people realize the reality of the issue that is still happening today? Violent protests often happen in communities that don't have good relationships with those who enforce the laws. Tension is a part of being human, and being in a situation that has so much can make an us versus them mentality. So many feel that violence is absolutely necessary in certain circumstances. The media today loves to cover the negative. Not to say they never show the positive, but people love seeing drama more than anything. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard about the Travis Scott concert, but how many have heard of the Andrew Brown Jr. protests this year? The issue is not only the system, it's the people in it. It's what grabs the audience's attention. And typically that's violent acts. How did they know this would work? Individuals were well aware of the power they held in the community. They see their influence on local businesses, public transportation, and more. They're aware that if they show violence, they won't receive sympathy. They won't demand, they won't engage in violence, and leadership was well aware that they can't engage in brutality. This was planned to be the most peaceful way possible. Nonviolence is power. It looks like speeches, marches, art. There's so many things that can portray a message in a nonviolent way. Alright guys, thank you for watching my presentation.